May 8, 1945. Neuburg Airfield, Bavaria. The war had ended less than 24 hours earlier, but the airfield still looked like it was holding its breath. An American sergeant from Ohio stood at the edge of the concrete apron, staring across rows of abandoned Messerschmitt Bf 109s lined nose-to-tail like metal gravestones. Frost still clung to the shaded sections of their wings. Some aircraft wore chipped camouflage and oil-stained cowls. Others looked factory-new, their tires barely scuffed, their guns unfired. Yesterday, these machines had been weapons. Today, they were relics waiting for judgment. Captain William Hartford moved slowly between them, clipboard in hand. Before the war, he had been an automotive engineer in Detroit. During the war, he became something else entirely, an aircraft intelligence officer tasked with understanding the enemy by dissecting what they left behind. Each fighter told a story if you knew how to read it. Hartford paused beside a Gustav variant with hastily patched bullet holes stitched across its fuselage. Soviet caliber hits. Another aircraft bore blackened scorch marks along its wing roots, clear evidence of American incendiary ammunition. A third sat untouched, pristine, abandoned so suddenly its canopy was still locked and its oxygen hose hung neatly in place. At Neuburg alone, Hartford counted 87 Bf 109s in various states of repair. Multiply that by hundreds of captured airfields from Norway to Italy, and the scale became staggering. Over 33,000 Bf 109s had been built during the war. Now, the most produced fighter aircraft in history had become the largest accumulation of unwanted military hardware the world had ever seen. Hartford's orders were deceptively simple. Catalog anything of intelligence value. Destroy everything else. But standing among these machines, feeling the cold aluminum beneath his gloved hand, he felt the weight of what they represented. These aircraft had shaped the air war from Spain to Stalingrad, from the English Channel to the gates of Moscow. And now they were to be erased in weeks. Behind a temporary wire fence, Hans Muller watched. Muller had been a Luftwaffe mechanic for most of the war, assigned to Neuburg after the collapse of German air defenses in the south. He had kept these fighters flying through shortages of fuel, parts, and trained pilots. He had rebuilt engines with scavenged components, safety-wired cracks that should have grounded aircraft permanently, and sent pilots into combat knowing the odds were hopeless. Now he watched American soldiers decide which machines would live a little longer and which would die immediately. 3 weeks later, destruction began. Bulldozers pushed entire rows of Bf 109s into heaps, their narrow landing gears snapping as fuselages collapsed against one another. At other bases, thermite charges were dropped into engine compartments, reducing precision-built power plants to molten slag. At Lechfeld, tanks were driven directly over parked fighters, crushing wings and cockpits beneath steel tracks. Muller watched from the edge of a detention compound as aircraft he had spent years keeping alive were destroyed in minutes. But not all of them were condemned. The victors did not agree on a single fate for German aviation. The Soviet Union moved first and decisively, loading trains with captured aircraft, engines, technical manuals, and, most importantly, German engineers. Entire factories were stripped and shipped east. The Western Allies were more selective, but no less interested. Hartford received revised orders in June. Instead of destroying everything, he was to identify the best surviving examples of each Bf 109 variant for evaluation. The British had already secured late-model G-series aircraft that had plagued RAF pilots in 1943. The Americans wanted the newest version, the Bf 109K, introduced only months before Germany's collapse. France had a different idea entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Marcel Dubois had watched his country fall in 1940. He had escaped, flown with the Free French, and returned with the Allied armies. Now, standing inside a partially intact aircraft factory in Regensburg, he saw something no one else did. The assembly lines were still there. The tooling survived the bombing. More remarkably, many of the workers had returned, desperate for wages in a shattered economy. Dubois asked a question that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Why not finish building them? France needed fighters. Its pre-war air force was gone, its infrastructure shattered. Allied aircraft were scarce and politically complicated to acquire. Yet here were hundreds of nearly complete Bf 109 airframes, piles of spare parts, and men who knew the aircraft intimately. By late summer 1945, the Regensburg factory was operational again, this time under French control. Bf 109G 14S rolled off the line wearing French roundels. German mechanics, supervised by French officers, assembled fighters that had once defended the Reich. Hans Müller was released from detention and hired back. Yesterday's enemy now maintained today's aircraft. In Czechoslovakia, the situation was even stranger. The Avia factory near Prague had produced Bf 109s under German occupation. When the war ended, they possessed airframes, wings, and tools, but no engines. The original Daimler-Benz DB 605s were gone, destroyed, seized, or shipped east. What they did have was a warehouse full of Junkers Jumo 211 engines originally intended for bombers. Engineers who had quietly sabotaged German production during the war now attempted something bordering on madness, mating bomber engines to fighter airframes. The result was unstable, nose-heavy, and dangerous. Test pilot Jan Dvorak took the first prototype airborne in 1946 and barely survived. "It flies," he reported, "but it wants to kill you." The aircraft became known as the Avia S-199. Pilots called it the Mule. Meanwhile, Spain followed a different path. Having flown Bf 109s since the Civil War, Spain faced chronic engine shortages. Rather than compromise performance, Hispano Aviation installed Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plant that drove Spitfires and Mustangs, into 109 airframes. The result was the HA-1112 Buchen. It looked German. It sounded British. And it flew reliably. Spanish 109s would remain in service into the mid-1960s, long after jet fighters had replaced them elsewhere. But the strangest chapter belonged to a nation that did not yet exist in 1945. In 1948, Israel needed an air force immediately. Embargoes left few options. Czechoslovakia, desperate for hard currency and sitting on warehouses of unwanted S-199s, found a buyer. Holocaust survivors would defend themselves in German fighters built by communists. The irony was unbearable. The necessity absolute. Israeli pilots learned quickly that the S-199 was unforgiving. It killed 2 of them in training. Another crashed when its guns fired through its own propeller. Yet on May 29, 1948, 4 of these aircraft took off to attack an Egyptian column advancing toward Tel Aviv. The damage was limited. The effect was decisive. Israel had an air force, and the Messerschmitt Bf 109, thought finished in 1945, had only begun its second life. By late 1948, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 no longer belonged to any single nation. It had become a wandering artifact of war, rebuilt, repurposed, misunderstood, and still dangerous. In Israel, the Avia S-199s were never loved. Pilots respected them only because survival demanded it. The aircraft's heavy Jumo engine twisted the airframe on takeoff, dragging the nose left with brutal torque. Landing required absolute concentration. One misjudged rudder input, and the fighter would ground loop, snapping landing gear like matchsticks. Israeli pilots joked that the airplane had 3 intentions: to kill the enemy, to injure its pilot, and to finish the job on landing. But the S-199 bought time. It forced Egyptian columns to scatter. It convinced Arab commanders that Israeli air power existed when, in truth, it barely did. By the time more suitable fighters arrived, Mustangs, Spitfires, Mosquitoes, the Mules had already served their purpose. Most were lost not to combat, but to gravity and mechanics. Only one S-199 was destroyed by enemy fire. The rest killed themselves. Across Europe, the Bf 109 continued its strange migration. In Finland, mechanics quietly resurrected aircraft officially listed as destroyed under armistice terms. Wings were hidden in barns. Engines disappeared into forests. When tensions with the Soviet Union flared again, those destroyed fighters reappeared, repainted, and airborne. Finnish ace Ilmari Jutalainen, one of the highest-scoring pilots in history, trained young aviators on the same aircraft he had flown during the war. "The 109 is honest," he told them. "It tells you exactly what it plans to do. Your job is to listen." In Switzerland, neutrality had preserved something rare: time. Swiss-built 109s, meticulously maintained and rarely pushed to combat limits, sat in storage with low hours and complete documentation. In 1973, when the Swiss government sold a dozen of them to civilian buyers, it triggered a sensation. These were not wrecks. They were survivors. They became the foundation of the modern Warbird movement. Former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Ditz, now in his 70s, flew one of these Swiss Gustavs at an air show. His takeoff was flawless. His landing smoother than many younger pilots could manage. "Modern aircraft are better at everything," he said afterward. "But this one has a soul." By the 1980s, the Bf 109 had transformed again, this time into a cultural artifact. Collectors hunted them obsessively. Museums competed for airframes. Restoration shops emerged on every continent. A strange global fraternity formed. Former enemies trading parts, manuals, and advice across borders that had once been killing fields. A Swedish machinist specialized in supercharger impellers. A New Zealand shop rebuilt propeller governors. One retired German engineer was the last man alive who understood the fuel injection system properly. Each aircraft became a puzzle assembled from fragments of history. In Egypt, divers discovered 109s buried beneath sand dunes since Rommel's retreat. Dry desert air had preserved engines so well that one started on its first attempt after 40 years of silence. In Norway, a fighter raised from a frozen lake still bore its pilot's gloves in the cockpit. Each recovery was treated like archaeology, because it was. But not everyone celebrated. In Poland, former forced laborers confronted restored aircraft with visible scars on their hands from wartime factories. One man, Stefan Kowalski, stared at a polished 109 at an airshow and whispered, "I built these to kill my people." The owner offered him the cockpit. He declined. "I've been close enough." By the 1990s, fewer than 60 Bf 109s were airworthy worldwide. Most were Spanish Buchans disguised to resemble wartime variants. Original German aircraft became priceless, insured for tens of millions, flown only on rare occasions, handled like fragile glass. The community split. Purists demanded authenticity, original engines, original flaws, original danger. Pragmatists argued for survival, modern avionics, safer fuel systems, reliable power plants. Then came tragedy. In 2003, a fully authentic Bf 109G crashed during an airshow. The rebuilt DB605 engine failed catastrophically. The pilot died. The aircraft was destroyed. After that, authenticity lost its argument. Most surviving aircraft were quietly modernized. Safety won. A new movement emerged. Exact replicas built from original blueprints using modern materials. They flew like 109s, sounded like 109s, and preserved history without destroying it. Museums accepted them. Veterans approved. "The feeling is right," one former Luftwaffe pilot said after flying a replica. "Even the rudder pedals feel the same." By 2010, the Bf 109 was no longer a weapon. It was a question. What do we do with machines built for evil when they are also engineering masterpieces? Do we destroy them, preserve them, fly them, or bury them? There was no single answer. Only responsibility. By the final months of the war, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was no longer a weapon of dominance, but a symbol of collapse. Germany's skies were emptying. Fuel was scarce. Trained pilots were gone. The once feared fighter now rose with teenage pilots who barely knew how to land, let alone fight. Many never returned. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of Bf 109 sat abandoned across Europe, on airfields, in forests, buried in sand or snow. Some were destroyed immediately. Others were captured, studied, reused, or repurposed in ways no one could have imagined during the war. France flew former Luftwaffe fighters with French roundels. Czechoslovakia built dangerous hybrid versions using bomber engines. Spain kept flying Merlin-powered Bf 109s into the 1960s. Israel, fighting for survival in 1948, used these same aircraft, built by former enemies, to buy time until real fighters arrived. The irony was brutal, but war does not care about irony. As decades passed, the Bf 109 changed again. From weapon, it became artifact. Mechanics, historians, and collectors began rescuing wrecks from lakes, deserts, and frozen tundra. Engines were rebuilt. Skins were repaired. Some aircraft flew again, rare, dangerous, priceless. Each flight carried the weight of history. Every landing was relief. Veterans who once fought these machines stood beside them at air shows. Some saluted. Some wept. Some simply touched the metal in silence. To them, the aircraft was not politics. It was memory. By the 21st century, fewer than 60 Bf-109s still flew worldwide. Most were replicas or heavily modified survivors. Original aircraft became too fragile, too valuable, too dangerous. One by one, they were grounded, not by enemy fire, but by time. Museums struggled with how to display them. As engineering marvels? As tools of terror? As warnings? There was no single truth. The Bf-109 meant different things in different places: defender, invader, oppressor, survivor. Yet the machine endured because people chose to preserve it, not to glorify war, but to remember its cost. Today, when a Bf-109 starts its engine and lifts into the sky, it is no longer a fighter. It is a monument in motion, a reminder of what happens when technology, ideology, and desperation collide. One day, the last Bf-109 will fly for the final time. The engine will stop, the propeller will fall silent, and the aircraft will rest forever. But until that day, the sound still echoes, not as a threat, but as a warning.